Welcome to Eyes on Israel. I'm Rabbi Pesach Willicke. As the pro-jihad, pro-terrorist protests rage across American college campuses, one question that we must consider is who benefits from them? A recent Harvard-Harris poll shows that upwards of 80% of Americans support Israel in its war against Hamas, and those numbers haven't really budged since October 7th. But when we look at the 18 to 24 age group, that number drops to 57%. In other words, college-age Americans are significantly more likely to back Hamas than their parents or grandparents are. But even this drop in support for Israel among younger Americans does not indicate a majority who would support the kind of militant anti-Semitism we're seeing at the protests at elite universities. In other words, these protests are far less popular than one would think from watching mainstream media. The premise of the protests is that Israel is committing genocide and was founded on the displacement of the native indigenous Palestinian people, two lies that we have discussed on this program. But those two lies are not merely talking points of the Marxist upper-middle-class student activists wearing keffiyehs at Ivy League schools. They're also the premise of the Biden administration's policies regarding Israel. The repeated calls for the creation of a Palestinian state and the false accusations by administration officials that Israel is causing excessive civilian casualties and withholding humanitarian aid lay the predicate for everything Biden and company are doing to prevent Israel from defeating Hamas. If these protests perpetuate and amplify these false narratives, creating the illusion that the American people want the government to put pressure on Israel, the Biden administration can point to them as a pretext for its policies, such as withholding vital weapons from Israel, as we saw recently. Let me put this another way. If we want to answer the question, who benefits from the pro-Hamas campus protests, a good place to start is by looking at who is paying for them. Joining me now is Cheryl Chumley, who has been following this story and has done the best reporting on the subject for the Washington Times, where she serves as online opinion editor. Cheryl, it's an honor to have you on Eyes on Israel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
So Cheryl, when we look at these protests and we see these tent camps and we see kind of the same slogans and the same types of tents, and this all kind of happens simultaneously, it really points to some funding apparatus that's going on. And you've done some very good reporting, very strong reporting on this topic. Could you fill us in on what you discovered? What's behind these protests?
So if you look at some of the funders of these protests, it's really the usual suspects, right? Either directly or indirectly, money is flowing into this protest movement through the George Soros Open Society Foundations, the Tide Foundations, the Rockefeller Brothers Trust, and the Hyatt heirs, Nick and Susan Pritzker. And interesting about those two is that while their money has flown into the protests on college campuses now, the very anti-Semitic, ugly protests, they've also had a history of donating directly to Joe Biden, most recently $300,000 to his campaign. So the ties between the Democrat Party, even the Joe Biden campaign, and the funders of these anti-Semitic protests are very close, very uncomfortable.
Well, Cheryl, there's a number of Jews in that list that you just shared, and we know that some of the organizations that are leading the protests are Jewish student organizations, which of course is a question that we've dealt with on the show, and it's something that confuses a lot of Americans. Why are there Jews who are anti-Israel here? But the larger question that one could ask, based on what you're saying, is what do they gain by this? Why would Biden donors who know the polling, they know the public sentiment, why would they be funding these protests? What interest do they have in setting campuses aflame with pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish demonstrations?
That's a really good question, right? And so you can take it in two parts because it's interesting to many Americans why Jews support the Democrat Party when the Democrat Party seems so anti-Semitic at root, and especially in recent years where they've been outed for the anti-Semitism. And I think that goes back to the history of the founding of Israel, right, which was based on a founding of a socialist ideal. Socialism was their ideology. And a lot of that runs through the nation right now with the kibbutzes and so forth. So you could make the case that many Jews in America who vote Democrat are looking at it from the point of view of socialism and so forth. But from the Democrat Party specifically, the Joe Biden campaign, this White House and so forth, their reasons for supporting these uprisings on college campuses is really a step back at the larger view of their agenda. And that is basically to crumble the Constitution from within our own borders, and to usher in some sort of government that was more in line with Marxism and communism and collectivism. And one way the Democrat Party achieves that is by dividing and conquering. And so they are exploiting the ignorance of many of these protesters on the college campuses to bring in this sort of greater goal to crumble America.
So what you're describing, it seems like this is 2024's version of the George Floyd protests with the Palestinian cause standing in for George Floyd, but the same script being run again.
That's a very good way to look at it, right? George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, the Antifa movement. These are all part and parcel of what the more globalist thinking in America see as tools to use to divide America and ultimately destroy America's freedoms. Because after all, America has been the great stumbling block to many of these globalist designs, right? We've discussed the Great Reset. We know what's taking place there. And America has been historically the stumbling block. And why? Because in our country, our rights come from God, and government is only there to preserve and protect those rights. So that really keeps the communist-minded at bay. It prevents them from ushering in a total top-down government control, because we as individuals know that we have individual rights that are rooted in a creator. Well, look at what's going on now in America, the turn down the path towards socialism, which comes simultaneously a turn away from God in this country. And you see that these globalist-minded have a chance like no other to usher in their globalist viewpoints and their agenda in America. And these campus protests are just being exploited for that end.
Cheryl, you said a few minutes ago that you see that the Jewish support for Israel was kind of rooted in the socialism, is the tie to socialism. And it's true, the vast majority of Jews in America are progressive left, and certainly the Jews that you mentioned as funders here. But I would argue, and again, I'm speaking as a Jew who's currently in Israel, and obviously been a member of the Jewish community my whole life. I think a lot of it is also this kind of Holocaust mentality that a lot of American Jews see Israel as this refuge and response to the Holocaust, but they don't want it to be anything more than that. And the fact that Israel has become a more religious, less socialist, more right-wing, more nationalist country over the last few years has really led a lot of these secular progressive Jews to move away from support for Israel. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of the younger Jews on campus supporting it, supporting and leading these protests. One topic I'd like to talk about with you that I see that you've also written a lot about is this whole obsession by the Biden administration and by the world to prevent Israel from going into Rafah. So we're coming up on a break in about 2 minutes, but that's still plenty of time to get started on it. And I'd like to hold you over for a second segment. But if you could just share your initial thoughts as we get into this conversation, and I have what to say, but why do you think it is that the Biden administration is so hell-bent on preventing Israel from destroying Hamas?
Well, they're throwing Israel under a bus. I don't know how else to characterize it. And on one hand, they're trying to act and put forth a narrative that they are solidly on the side of Israel. But on the other hand, if you look at their actions and you look at their other rhetoric coming out of this White House, it says otherwise.
Yeah, and you know, I think back to the Trump administration, and when Donald Trump was in office, Israel, a lot of people don't realize this, but the 3 years in Israel's history, from 1948 till today, that had the fewest terrorist casualties were the years 2018, 19, and 20. Actually, 20 was the lowest, 19 was the second lowest, and 18 was the third lowest in Israel's history. And you could really draw a straight line from Trump's policies, where his policy in the Middle East was to punish the bad actors and reward the friends of America, potential friends of America, in order to achieve peace. That was what Peace Through Strength was really about. And I think the bigger question that hangs in the air over all of this is, what is the geopolitical goal? Like, what is the geostrategic goal of the Biden administration in coddling Iran and getting so close to them and wanting to appease them and never calling them out? They've still never called out Iran for funding Hamas. They've never called out Qatar, who Biden calls a strategic ally, for funding Hamas. So I want to touch on these topics when we come back from commercial break. We're going in there now. This is Eyes on Israel, and we're talking to Cheryl Chumley, the online opinion editor of the Washington Times and one of the best journalists in America. I follow Cheryl. It's an honor to have you here. I've been following you for a long time, reading your work, and it's an honor to have you here. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a few moments. Do you long to connect more deeply with the powerful sacred words of the Psalms, to pray and rejoice through the very words that King David uttered to the Almighty? The Israel Bible Book of Psalms Pray Like David edition makes this possible through an ingenious blend of faithful English translation and a complete English transliteration of all 30,000 plus Hebrew words. Don't miss this unique opportunity to pray like David and make his spiritual outpourings your own. Go to praylikedavid.com to buy your copy of the Israel Bible Book of Psalms, Pray Like David edition, today, and gain unparalleled access to the divinely inspired prayers that have uplifted the people of Israel for millennia.